So, Steve, last time we talked, we were chatting about the idea of a traditional org chart versus a matrix structure versus value stream, and do you really? And I made the point. So, the one question is is the future of work where everybody's just primarily organized around value streams and platform teams and team topology style structures, um, with no hierarchical organizational structure? And I'd made the point that. I can also see a pathway where there's a balance, where you need that traditional hierarchical structure. For example, I made the case about balancing just the finances, that at some point the corporation exists as a single entity. Somewhere, somebody along the line has to balance profit and loss across different departments, say, and figure out what's the sum, what's the net profit for the organization. Are we spending too much, et cetera, et cetera? A unifying identity for the organization as represented by the CEO. And I'd just love your take on that. What do you think? Is the radical reformation of companies, gradual transition, both?
I think, I always advocate, I think a radical transformation, I think, is very costly, right? I mean, we tend to have unpredictable side effects from anything too sudden and too dramatic. It's very hard to see what is happening when we do something radical, right? I mean, the most recent thing that I think of is pulling out of Afghanistan. So a sudden shift. It's a terrible thing, but it sticks. It's in my working memory, so it keeps coming up. But this idea that when you suddenly change something, it's very unpredictable what's going to happen in that, and you do have things like power vacuums, right? I mean, if you do restructure an organization, it's an opportunity for people to make moves that are in their best interest, that they think are in the best interest of the organization. There's a lot that can happen in the fog of that chaos, and you can't really see what you've ended up with until the dust settles. And that can be a very long time. And I think it just feels very wasteful and destructive and unsettling to folks who really, I think most people like stability. Most people like to know where they stand, whether that's within an organization, within a hierarchy, whether, their experience is valued. They feel a sense of progression. Oftentimes when we do these radical reformations, people's job titles are changing, and all of a sudden, they could be, okay, well, I'm in the same spot in the organization now, but my job title changed. So relative to the industry, it actually looks like I've taken a step back. Or, I was hoping that this was an opportunity for me to finally get to this level that I've hoped to reach, and it hasn't happened. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, it might happen the next time there's a radical revolution. And that seems now very far off. And so I think that kind of having these big bang changes are very risky, very costly, very stressful, and not necessary. We always advise folks to introduce change with pilots, with single teams, with experiments, with small steps that are measured. And that's not to say that you can't imagine future states and ideal states and use them to kind of guide your direction and say, what if we rethought everything? But it's more like a what if than a let's do this and see what happens, right? I think the ability to simulate and hypothesize and experiment and make small bets in the context of big bets is great. Breaking down big bets into small ones, I think, is a great way to actually execute on this type of change. It's another thing that I really love about mapping is that it's also a simulation mechanism, right? It's a tool for simulation as much as it is for visualizing the current state. You can use it to say, okay, well, what if we reorganized all the Post-its and the flow worked this way versus the way that it is right now? It's a very cheap way of having somewhat, very challenging conversations with the team, right? What if we no
We
longer
got rid of
reported to
that
the same?
group.
Right, exactly. What if we all, started working in a totally different way? What would that look like? And you could sort of imagine, okay, well, we could do these things in parallel. We wouldn't go to this team anymore. Maybe they provide us with something that we can just consume. I think that's really productive. And the alternative of the Big Bang transformation, it just seems like there's limited visibility in that effort. There's limited ability to measure versus a baseline, right? I mean, how are you going to tell? When are you going to know that it's better than your current state, right? And how are you going to know that an alternative scenario, a counterfactual, wouldn't have been better? So I'm very much in favor of big bets broken down, executed as small experiments, and then using a measured baseline so that you know whether you're headed in the right direction or not.
The analogy of pulling out of Afghanistan suddenly is a stark example. But there's three examples that come to mind. One is just the history of political revolutions, that the entire country, as you say, is set back or slowed down when you massively disrupt the stability of a country through new governments. But at the very least, the whole country is slowed down tremendously while there's that uncertainty. And it's not conducive to people putting their whole heart into their work if they're not sure if it's even safe, if their job's going to be around, if their company's going to be around, et cetera. If their government ministry is going to be around. And the vast majority of new governments we see arising, that tend to end up as just as corrupt as the previous governments, right? So it's not an enormously great history. And so as dysfunctional as we could say the US government is, right now, it's still, the trash gets collected every day across the whole country, and the world, they keep functioning, the wheels keep turning. So incredibly stable compared to a lot of other nations, for example. So that radical transformation, typically not ideal for a company. But you think about two other examples. One, the corporate reorg, especially sales territory reorg that happens every year, where you basically take all your salespeople and get them point focused on a new set of accounts, and you're just disrupting those relationships. And somebody's got a new idea, but then all of a sudden you've got the salespeople with a totally different set of relationships that they've got to build up. There's no motivation to look at the long-term benefit that account is going to get from year to year to year. So enormously disruptive for folks in sales, and sometimes a healthy disruption like a forest fire, right? You can see the possibility of benefit growing back, but at a great cost, and also totally interrupting your ability to really measure gradual transformation. And the last analogy would be refactoring your code base. How many times do engineering teams stumble upon an app and spend a couple of weeks looking at it and then just say, we've got to rewrite the whole thing, right? And it's extremely well-established lore in the software development world. Don't rewrite the app. Don't do it. I know it's tempting. I know it's a disaster. Don't do it. And this idea of the strangler pattern that Martin Fowler introduced, like a strangler fig surrounding a tree, and then using the existing infrastructure of the tree to grow and build, but the strangler fig grows its own roots and branches and becomes stronger until eventually the tree itself dies and the strangler fig is taken over. And in a similar way, if there is a new org structure to be found, or lined around value streams and so forth, approaching it in this, like the strangler pattern, approaching it like this, introducing it gradually, testing it out, seeing, is it helping, right? And then very much in the spirit of continuous improvement, and all, which is the roots of all of this anyway, continuous improvement. And then once you've completed that transition, what are you left with? you're left with a mindset of continuous improvement that wants to continue improving, right? And so you're never done with this, no matter how you've restructured things. You just see better, and you've reduced a lot of the inefficiencies that were otherwise hidden.
Yeah, I think that thinking about the strangler pattern for organizations is a very helpful metaphor. I think that is the path forward. Because you mentioned in the last conversation that, we still do need this hierarchical structure for certain things like reporting, finance, and possibly human resources. I don't think that that's true. I think it's true at the moment, and I think it will be true until you fully transition to a stream-oriented model, which would be a value stream network, right? But we don't really know what that looks like yet, because I don't think that we have a good example to follow, and a lot of data on how that works, and how information flows, and how authority and decisions flow through the organization. But that's my suspicion, is that stream orientation can accomplish all of the goals of the organization in a network structure, but definitely, certainly the right way to do that is with this strangler approach of, let's not slash and burn everything, or wait for a bankruptcy scenario that forces us to rethink things, or forces our hand. Introducing disruption, like a planned, I'm not sure what it's called, but it's sort of like that planned burn, where we want to make sure controlled burn, exactly. Right. Controlled burn is I think is a great practice. I think that also, it makes me think of kind of red team exercises, where you test things, intentionally try to stress your system. And imagine, what would happen if we hit one of these known challenging states, or even, imagine a black swan scenario, what happens. That I think is really healthy, and sort of self-disruption to an extent that we kind of gain this sense of comfortable discomfort, and growth, sustainable growth, where, in exercise, I'm working with a personal trainer right now, and the whole concept is like progressive overload. You're just constantly, it just hurts every day, just a little, just enough, like you're just pushing yourself just enough. And that's how things work. And I think that is continuous improvement embodied. And we focus a lot on the individual, but continuous improvement of organizations, continuous improvement of teams, from a performance, but I think what we're talking about here is from an operational model perspective, right? The operating model, testing that, stressing that, simulating alternates for that, it will become something of a regular practice as we see things like ways of working teams grow in popularity.
Well, I'm really grateful for your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Likewise.